Thank you so much, Doug and Jane. Fantastic presentations. I want to point everyone to the Q&A. There's been so much great interaction there. We've had some wonderful questions and some really constructive answers going on there. So please check out the Q&A. And if you hit the answered column, you'll be able to see how our panelists are addressing those questions as they come up. So during the registration process, registrants had the opportunity to pose some questions to our panelists today. So Doug, Jane, Gabe, Becky, if you don't mind joining us. The first question that was raised prior to the program is this: how beneficial or what impact do butterflies have on human health? Are the home butterfly raising kits detrimental to the butterflies?
I can take the human health part if nobody else is interested. That's really two different questions there. What is essential to human health is functional ecosystems, and every species that's in an ecosystem enables that ecosystem to function, produce ecosystem services. There's a lot of research that has shown as you increase the number of species in an ecosystem, you increase productivity and stability. And as you take species away, you decrease ecosystem productivity and stability. So it's not that butterflies are more important than anything else. All the species are important. And if we take any of them away, we start to lose the integrity of the ecosystem. So, and now that's essential to human health.
I'll talk about butterfly kits if you want. When you're raising those little butterfly kits at home, they aren't going to replace the natural population, and that's a much more of a habitat issue. But assuming you've got good, healthy butterflies, it's not going to damage anything. But what it is going to do, what I find in my own experience, is it's going to get kids in particular, but sometimes adults, excited about preserving habitat and restoring habitat. It's something I see a lot in the work we do, is that I can talk all day doing outreach about, loss of biodiversity and disappearing species, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't resonate with people, and it's very bloodless and it's very clinical. But when people are interacting with our beautiful native butterflies and you explain to them that these are probably going to be gone from the face of the planet forever in 10 years, if we don't do something about it, something changes in their eyes. And so I'm an advocate that people in general, in my experience, if they do have the chance to interact, and so few kids get outside these days, that if they can interact in some way with nature's marvels, it makes them connect and want to save and preserve it. And we desperately need that. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Doug, you just put out a book on oaks, and we had a couple questions come up both live here in the chat and during the registration process, asking questions about oaks. So one that I want to pose to you, and feel free to elaborate, anyone else. What is the impact of injecting oak trees for scale treatment?
Well, that would be with a systemic insecticide that is taken up by the oak. And if it's successful, it will control the scales. But of course, it's expressed in all the tissues of the oak. So it's also eliminating the ability of the oak to support anything else, like all those caterpillars I was talking about. If you have a very serious scale infestation, and many of our scales are non-native insects, they're here without many of their natural enemies. So, invasive species, not good. Then sometimes it's necessary to treat, but don't treat just because you see a scale, because that does eliminate the productivity of that oak for probably a couple of years.
Thank you. We've had registrants signing up from across North America, including out west. Would anyone like to comment on the similarities and differences between the West Coast migration and how populations are faring in the Western United States and the Western half of North America and in the East and Great Plains?
Jennifer, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Speaking to the most recent reports of the populations, just for this audience's sake, if they're not aware, the monarch butterfly in North America is divided into two populations. More or less, it's a population that lives and breeds east of the Rocky Mountains, and another population that lives and breeds west of the Rocky Mountains. They're both not doing very well. The report out this past year was around just over 2 hectares of overwintering monarchs. Every year, the monarch is counted on its overwintering grounds in central Mexico. And that report of about 2 hectares of overwintering monarchs is less than half of our goal for stabilizing the population, up around 6 hectares. It's also lower than the prior year. In the West, it's extremely dire. The overwintering monarch population is down about 99% of its historic highs. So there's a lot of urgency, especially around the Western population right now. And the Monarch Joint Venture is engaged with our partners in the West to try to provide funding for some shovel-ready projects over there to increase habitat in the West.
Thank you. I have a question for Gabe. Since we weren't able to see the full scope of your presentation, which will be available afterwards, I want to ask you a question. When you think about your experience in working with landowners, what's your starting point when you're talking, whether it's milkweed or other pollinator species? How do you approach working with landowners to encourage pollinator planting or milkweed specifically?
I think the key is to remember, and we've had a couple questions pop into the Q&A that have sort of reflected this, like, I've got a pollinator garden. I've tried to tuck my neighbors into it. Why aren't they jumping up and down, right? Well, God bless us all. We're all unique, right? And we have different objectives and priorities for how we want to translate our footprint into something positive. And right, we can define that in extraordinarily different ways. But there's a couple like overarching things that seem to come through. If you ask any property owner, the desire to recreate commonly comes through as a top priority. Most landowners do not understand what they're saying when they say this. Most landowners also want to provide wildlife habitat. And as acreage gets bigger and bigger, we commonly assume like, oh, you've got 200 acres of, let's say, woodlands. You must really put a high priority on sort of the potential timber revenue that you're stockpiling for some future decade. Some landowners are, and that's wonderful, but far fewer than we would expect are. There is a lot of those more intangible priorities that a landowner will voice. And what that means is, for most landowners, without even attempting, they're coming hungry for that sort of knowledge. So I've got a green thumb. I love to garden, but trying to grow some species of plants in Ohio that aren't adapted to our environment, it's a pain, right? It's not really geared for thriving in our environment. So what that means is, for most landowners, in terms of like getting their hands dirty, planting something on the landscape, native species of wildflower are adapted to Ohio's climate, Ohio's soil types, Ohio's wet, dry precipitation cycles. What that means is, once you get pollinator habitat established, if it's native, maintenance, long-term maintenance, keeping it alive and keeping it functioning as habitat tends to be easier, rather than trying to push that big heavy ball up the hill, trying to get a plant to survive that didn't want to be here in the first place. So sort of that ease of management is a really nice selling point that most landowners who have been stymied, right, have seen sort of a propagation effort fail. That leverages into native habitat pretty easily. Not to say that establishment's easy, but once established, native plants are well equipped to thrive for the long haul. So that becomes a pretty nice talking point and opportunity.
Can I briefly weigh in, Joe? We're talking about changing the culture. Most of us were raised in a culture where humans and nature didn't mix. Humans are here and nature someplace else. We like nature, we like to visit it, it can entertain us, but we're not going to live with it. And now all of a sudden we're saying, yes, we are, we're going to live with it. That's a big change for a lot of people. It's threatening to a lot of people. I do see changes though. You know, I've been talking about this for approaching 15 years now, and I see a lot more interest. Those headlines that we're seeing, you know, losing birds and the insects, losing the monarch, you know, got the ball rolling along with the honeybee. A lot of people are concerned, and they're willing to start changing that culture. So it's not as hard to convince people in general as it used to be. I'm encouraged.
So on the topic of behaviors and neighbors, someone asked the question, is if my neighbors are applying a mosquito treatment in their yards, is that a threat to pollinators in their yards, in the neighboring yard?
Yes. Well, it depends on what the mosquito treatment is, but when it's a fog, it drifts. And there are examples. I mean, I've got a friend who's worked very hard to help his monarchs, and he says, you know, I got all the milkbees, I've got nothing. And I said, does your neighbor spray? Yep. So, yeah, that's another thing we don't realize. What we do on our property affects other properties. And so everybody says we got the right to do whatever we want on our property, but inherently we know that's not true. We know that we don't have the right to release smallpox spores, or if a stream goes through our yard, we can't pour cyanide in there. We get it that impacts other people. So do the plants and our behaviors on our property impact other people and other things.
Thank you. Anybody else want to elaborate on that point?
Yeah, I mean, yes, we've seen it, particularly because we're in a rural area. And so people treating, we had a disaster last summer when people were spraying some, on an adjoining property, spraying pesticide on pecans with 25-mile-an-hour winds, giant fogs with a giant fogger. And we've got a 13-acre prairie remnant on the farm, never plowed. That's beautiful and brimming with life. In 24 hours, everything on it was dead. You know, so and the kind of the ironic thing is doing outreach. I always tell people when you're putting your pollinator plot in, be sure, you know, to worry about drift, talk to your neighbors. And I was my own test subject that day. So yeah, it happens. I've seen it.
Thank you. We've had some questions come up about oaks and oak species in particular. Are there any oak species that our panelists would recommend here in the state of Ohio, or just generally to benefit monarchs and ecosystem biodiversity?
Well, oaks benefit ecosystems and biodiversity better than any other plant genus, but not particularly monarchs. There's four things that every landscape should do: support a food web, help the pollinators, sequester carbon, and manage the watershed. And oaks are the best at 3 out of 4 of those. They are not the best at supporting pollinators because they're wind pollinated. So they make lots of caterpillars, but not monarchs, because monarchs are host plant specialists that did not specialize on oaks.
Doug, while you're speaking to that, there's a number of other questions. You referred to oaks as a keystone plant. Are there other woody keystone plants that would sort of occupy Ohio's region, or forbs that might also sort of garner that same label?
Yes, and if you go to the National Wildlife Federation website, to the Native Plant Finder, and put in your zip code, the ranked list of both woody plants and herbaceous plants in terms of their ability to support caterpillars will pop up for your county. So that's a keystone list based on caterpillars, but we're also working on a keystone list based on specialist pollinators. We really want to support the specialist pollinators because the generalist pollinators can use the plants that the specialists use as well. But they're, out of the 4,000 species of native bees that we have, about 1/3 of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plant genera. So for example, goldenrod, there's at least 13 species of bees that are only going to reproduce on goldenrod in Ohio. As far as other keystone woody plants in Ohio, willows are ranked very high, native prunus, so things like black cherry, pin cherry, American plum. Birches are high. They all have fewer species than oaks, but they're still very, very strong species, as opposed to something like a tulip tree that supports only 21 species of caterpillars compared to that hundreds that oaks support. Those are the difference. Or a ginkgo that supports 0, or your crepe myrtle or your Bradford pear. Those ornamental plants that we load the landscape with aren't supporting the caterpillars.
Thank you. Becky, we've been talking a lot about culture, behavior change, changes in land decision-making. What have you noticed in your work over the last, say, 5 years in integrated vegetation management along utility rights of way? And what suggestions would you give to maybe others who work in this area, or other landowners for that matter?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So I think the greatest thing over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of more regulation in the power industry. And because of that regulation, we did see some, pretty quick, aggressive reaction to that. I know now, and actually it's a longer time frame, it's really within the last 15 years, as power companies have really converted their rights away from tall growing plants to the low growing compatible, sustainable plant communities that I talked about in my discussion earlier. It's really in a much better place. Definitely saw some questions in the chat regarding practices and how utilities, get to that place with low growing plant communities. The integrated approach, as I mentioned, it's a multitude of methods, but ultimately, once we arrive at that low growing plant community, there's a biological control where those compatibles are really out competing the taller growing. And so the footprint, or the maintenance or management is less necessary and becomes less of an environmental impact to it. The other great thing about integrated vegetation management that we've learned over time is there are many situations where we're actually releasing threatened endangered species that in the past, because of all the tall growing vegetation, they were there in the seed beds but weren't released. So there are some, very positive activity coming out of that work. I mentioned also the candidate conservation agreement. That's just a huge effort amongst both transportation and energy lands where, that collaboration is essential. We are using resources specifically and really trying to drive a focus of managing those compatible native plants, addressing invasives where we can and have resources to do so. So I think that kind of holistically answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. We have time really for 1 or 2 more questions. So I want to pose this to everybody. We've been experiencing a lot of change in our lives in these past year. And as we look forward into the year 2021, into the summer season, at least here in North America ahead, what gives you the most hope in the work that you're involved with on a daily basis? Where are you deriving hope of restoring the monarch? And what can you offer to the rest of us?
I'll start for a moment. In my organization, there's been a huge commitment to environmental stewardship over the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years that maybe wasn't there in the past. In my role, I'm really trying to educate that our rights of way do provide habitat for pollinators that was maybe not recognized in the past, and that we have to continue to, apply best management practices, collaborate with our peers, educate landowners on, how we can work together. And we're making some progress, and, we do get approached with a lot of different partnerships, and just trying to evaluate those and make sure that, everywhere that we can engage and educate and, share resources for creating pollinator habitat, we are trying to do that. And it's much more of a focus, and it gives me hope because it didn't get a lot of attention in the past.
I'm hoping that a lot of the people that reconnected with nature during COVID because they couldn't go anywhere, that they don't lose that they hang on to that when things get back to normal, if they do. That's my big hope for the future.
I see hope in the pressure and push from the kind of ordinary citizen base. The way that they recognize the monarch and react to the monarch is just astounding. And so when these numbers come out about their populations and when announcements come out about their status under the Endangered Species Act, people recognize that, people realize that, people connect with it. As Jane was talking about earlier, that the monarch can be a connection for people to get engaged in the outdoors and conservation. And so to know that there is that base that speaks up and advocates for the monarch, and ultimately, as Doug was saying, more than monarchs, that is absolutely inspiring.
Yeah, I might take the easy trail here. And as a college professor and faculty member in research and teaching and constant interface with students, I'm encouraged by the explosive growth that I've witnessed at the School of Environment and Natural Resources since I came here 8 or 9 years ago. Dean Kress, Provost McFerrin, Dr. Jeff Sharp, Joe, like we've all seen it. Like we are bursting at the seams, and that gives me hope that there's also an underlying generational transformation that will translate to real meaningful change when these students are then professionals and occupying those corner offices. The discovery themes that sustainability is something that not just environmental and natural resource students are going to be trained in. Every Ohio State student will have some general education requirements related to sustainability. Like that's encouraging. That's scaled change. So perhaps more of a, oh, I would have expected a Ohio State answer to sound like that, but for real, that's encouraging.
So I'm going to go in a different direction. So I work a lot in rural Oklahoma, and many of whom people out there don't have college degrees. A lot of them don't even have high school degrees. Many of them are landowners. Some of them are just people living on small land parcels. But what I see out there between, it doesn't matter, Native people, non-Native people alike in rural Oklahoma, there is such a passion for doing this. Is people are getting the word, they want to help. I have like the most grizzled old rancher farmer types who, you know, after like going through a presentation will say, well, I was going to go home and mail down that milkweed patch, but after I heard you talk, I didn't. I left it there for the butterflies. And, you know, I hear that kind of stuff all the time. And so seeing how everybody's getting engaged with this, not just people at universities, but everybody, because again, we've all got to, it's all hands on deck. So it's exciting to me to see that it's the big tent that we really are bringing people on board. And that's what gives me hope and makes me feel motivated and excited. So.
I have a question for everybody. Is milkweed still listed as a noxious weed for agriculture?
State by state, it's different. So yeah, some places it is, I think still.
That's an issue.
Yep. And mowing, and, you know, of course, the dots and the mowing issue, you know, that's another with the departments of transportation. And you know, that's always another challenge we see where we are, because the communication there is always not great, because you'll see milkweed, it's full of caterpillars. And then the next week you go by and.
Yeah, I see that all the time.
Yeah. So anyway, so, yeah.
Well, thank you for those words.